It seemed like a routine juvenile case in Courtroom 12B, until a 17-year-old walked in alone dressed in a hoodie and worn jeans. With no lawyer in sight, the judge smirked, the bailiff chuckled, and the prosecutor leaned back already convinced of an easy win. "Where's your lawyer, kid?" the judge asked mockingly. But the teen, Ethan Rivera, replied calmly, "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." Laughter rippled through the room, but Ethan didn't flinch. What no one knew was that this so-called defendant had spent years studying the law in secret. He wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to expose the truth. Over the next few days, he dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, revealing not only his innocence, but something far more shocking, a hidden conspiracy that reached beyond the courtroom walls. By the time anyone realized what was really happening, Ethan had already flipped the script and the system. If that opening got you hooked, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves courtroom twists, and subscribe for more mind-blowing stories just like this one. You won't want to miss what happens next. The buzzing of whispers filled Courtroom 12B as the next case was called. Spectators leaned forward, flipping through their notes and phones, expecting just another juvenile hearing routine. Forgettable. That expectation was shattered when the double doors swung open and in walked a 17-year-old boy. No parents by his side, no suited attorney shuffling legal papers, just Ethan Rivera, tall for his age, thin and dressed in a faded hoodie, scuffed sneakers and worn jeans. His expression was calm, almost indifferent, but his eyes carried a sharpness that didn't match the rest of him. Judge Halverson glanced up from his file and did a double take. Known around the circuit for being firm, impatient, and borderline sarcastic, the judge squinted over his glasses, unimpressed. "This isn't a school debate, son," he said, voice tinged with condescension. "Where's your attorney?" Without hesitation, Ethan stepped forward to the defense table, placing a single folder down in front of him. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor," he said evenly. A few seconds of silence followed, then came the chuckles. A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom like a small wave. The bailiff smirked. A reporter in the back scribbled a note with a raised brow. Even the seasoned prosecutor, Ms. Angela Grant, let out a breathy laugh as she turned toward him. "You're joking, right?" she said, amused. "This is a felony case, not a mock trial, I assure you," Ethan replied calmly. "I'm not joking, and I'm ready to proceed." Judge Halverson leaned back in his chair, clearly entertained. He tapped his gavel once, more for effect than order. "Well then, let's see what you got, counselor." What no one seemed to take seriously was that Ethan Rivera wasn't just some reckless teen playing pretend. He stood accused of two serious charges: illegal hacking into a government server and obstruction of justice in an ongoing federal investigation. The prosecution had called it a highly sophisticated cyber breach, involving the deletion of key evidence from encrypted databases. And here stood the accused, unaccompanied, unrepresented and apparently undeterred. A few more glances were exchanged among the room's legal professionals. Most assumed Ethan would fold under pressure within minutes. A pre-trial motion here, a missed objection there, and the case would be over before lunch. But Ethan didn't slouch. He didn't fidget. He adjusted the mic, opened his folder, and calmly began reviewing the indictment as though he'd done it 100 times before. The clerk whispered something to the bailiff, who snorted and replied under his breath, "Kid probably watched a few law dramas and thinks he's the next Harvey Specter." Ms. Grant, meanwhile, prepared her opening statement, already anticipating a swift conviction. She'd dealt with self-represented defendants before. They were always arrogant, always underprepared, and always out of their depth. But from the moment the first pre-trial motions were introduced, something didn't feel normal. Ethan challenged the authenticity of the digital evidence. He questioned the chain of custody of the data. He cited obscure legal codes with precise articulation, cross-referencing prior rulings that even the judge had to double-check. Grant's confident smirk faltered slightly as she flipped through her binder, realizing she hadn't anticipated this level of resistance. Judge Halverson narrowed his eyes. "Where exactly did you say you learned the law, Mr. Rivera?" Ethan looked up. "I didn't. I studied it." It was subtle, but something shifted in the room. The laughter stopped. The whispers dulled. No one said it aloud, but an unspoken tension began to settle over the courtroom. Whatever game this teenager was playing, it was suddenly starting to feel very real. By the second day of trial, something had clearly shifted. The courtroom, once filled with smirks and whispers, now sat in a tense, skeptical silence. What was supposed to be a formality, an arrogant teenager stumbling his way through legal jargon, was quickly becoming something very different. Ethan Rivera wasn't just keeping up, he was running the show. From the moment court resumed, Ethan's confidence had sharpened into command. He questioned witnesses with surgical precision, using calm, measured language that made seasoned professionals visibly uncomfortable. When the prosecution submitted screenshots of supposed chat logs tying him to the cyber attack, Ethan raised an eyebrow, then calmly stood. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to question the authenticity of this exhibit. May I?" Judge Halverson nodded, still watching Ethan like a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. Ethan approached the monitor, flipping through the digital files. These logs, according to the metadata, were last modified 2 days after the government's servers were allegedly breached. He turned to the courtroom. "That would suggest tampering, not from me, from whoever wants me to look guilty." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Grant stiffened behind her podium, lips pressed tight. She interrupted quickly. "Your Honor, I object. This line of questioning is speculative, and beyond the scope of this witness's expertise." Judge Halverson glanced at her, then back at Ethan. "Mr. Rivera," he asked, leaning forward, "where exactly did you learn all this?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "A lot, and I pay attention." His voice was steady, unfazed, as if he belonged at that table more than anyone else. The judge stared at him for a moment longer than necessary, then slowly nodded. But behind the scenes, Ms. Grant was losing patience. During a break, she angrily approached the judge in chambers and demanded an investigation. She was convinced Ethan had help, maybe a mentor, maybe an attorney feeding him lines from outside the courtroom. No way a teenager could do this alone, but the court's own inquiry found nothing. No hidden earpieces, no phones, no advisors, just Ethan, a worn-out folder, and an encyclopedic knowledge of the law. Every motion filed had his handwriting, every reference was accurate, every strategy was his. And then, in the middle of cross-examination on day 3, Ethan dropped a bombshell. "I request a court-ordered forensic audit of the server logs that contain the original evidence against me," he said, standing confidently. The courtroom froze. Ms. Grant blinked. "A what?" she asked, her tone clipped. "A forensic audit," Ethan repeated. "I believe those logs were manipulated, and I can prove it." Judge Halverson arched an eyebrow, folding his hands. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Rivera. Why would anyone tamper with government evidence?" Ethan took a breath. "Because the truth is inconvenient, and someone's trying very hard to bury it." Ms. Grant immediately objected, calling the request a waste of time and a delay tactic. But Ethan had anticipated her resistance. "I've already contacted an independent analyst who's willing to testify." He flagged inconsistencies in the data hashes, submitted in discovery. The timestamps don't match the original logs. Someone edited them and didn't cover their tracks well enough. Judge Halverson stared at Ethan, the amusement completely gone from his expression. He wasn't smirking now. "I'll allow it," the judge said slowly. "But if this turns out to be a stunt, it won't help your case." Ethan nodded, calmly returning to his seat. He didn't smile, he didn't glow. He simply opened his folder and began preparing for what was next, like a chess player who already knew how the final move would play out. 3 days later, the results of the court-ordered forensic audit arrived, and what they revealed turned the courtroom on its head. Judge Halverson entered the courtroom with the audit file in hand, his face unreadable. Everyone was on edge. Ms. Grant sat stiffly at the prosecution table, fingers tapping nervously against her legal pad. Ethan, calm as ever, sat quietly reviewing his notes. He didn't fidget. He didn't look worried. In fact, he looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the independent forensic audit has been completed. It appears the defendant's concerns were not only valid, but deeply troubling." A murmur of confusion and disbelief spread through the gallery. Judge Halverson continued, more slowly now. "The evidence submitted by the prosecution was in fact tampered with. Timestamps were altered, data logs were manipulated, and perhaps most disturbing, several of the IP addresses associated with the breach trace back to a private cybersecurity firm contracted by the district attorney's office." He looked directly at Ms. Grant, without any record of that authorization on file. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan stood slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I believe what we're looking at is a deliberate effort to falsify evidence and frame an innocent person. This isn't just a mistake. This is prosecutorial misconduct." Gasps filled the room. Cameras clicked like wildfire. Reporters leaned forward, pens flying across notepads. Judge Halverson slammed his gavel to restore order, but the damage was done. The courtroom had erupted. "I'll need a recess," Grant said, barely holding her composure. "I don't think a recess is going to fix this." Judge Halvorson replied, his voice low and grave. If this audit is accurate, this is grounds for an immediate mistrial, and possibly an internal investigation. He turned to Ethan, eyes narrowing, not in judgment, but in curiosity. Who are you? Ethan held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small smile. My name is Ethan Rivera. I've completed multiple online law certification programs, including constitutional and criminal law module. I passed California's first-year law students examination, the baby bar last year. I've been studying law since I was 13, and I didn't come here just to defend myself. I came here because I knew the system was being manipulated, and I needed a way. A stunned silence fell over the room. Even the court clerk, who had been skeptical from day one, stopped typing for a moment, eyes wide. Reporters furiously typed on their laptops. Every camera lens in the room seemed to zoom in on Ethan. Grant finally stood, but she no longer looked confident. Her voice trembled. This is absurd. You can't be seriously suggesting this child outmaneuvered a district attorney's office. He didn't outmaneuver us, Judge Halvorson said quietly. He exposed, and then he turned back to Ethan. This court is going to take a short recess to determine next steps, he said. But let me be clear, this is no longer a standard trial. This is something else entirely. Ethan nodded. Understood, Your Honor. But as he returned to his seat, there was no sense of celebration in his face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't victorious. He looked focused, as if the game had only just begun. Because for Ethan Rivera, revealing the planted evidence was just the first move. And the real story, the reason he allowed himself to be put on trial in the first place, was still waiting to unfold. The courtroom was unusually quiet when the recess ended. Everyone filed back in, but there was a noticeable shift in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate between every person present. As Judge Halvorson called the session back to order, all eyes were on Ethan. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look smug either. He simply walked to the front of the courtroom, carrying a sealed envelope in his hand. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued but wary. Mr. Rivera, I trust you're not here to waste any more of the court's time. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting the silence stretch just a little longer, building anticipation. Then without hesitation, he placed the envelope on the judge's desk. There's something else, he said, his voice steady. The real reason I was framed. The room grew even quiet. Ethan's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Judge Halvorson motioned for him to proceed, his expression unreadable. Ethan carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several documents, placing them in front of the judge. These are records I uncovered during my investigation into the hacking incident, he began. And they tell a story no one here is ready to hear. The judge leaned in, examining the papers. The room watched in silence, the gravity of what was unfolding sinking. My older brother Jacob Rivera, Ethan continued, his voice unwavering, was a whistleblower. He was investigating illegal surveillance contracts tied to high-ranking government officials who are connected to this office, and to Ms. Grant. Grant flinched at the mention of her name, but Ethan didn't look at her. His focus remained squarely on Judge Halvorson. Jacob discovered that several government agencies had been using private firms to conduct illegal surveillance on citizens. They didn't just track criminals, they were gathering personal data on anyone they deemed a threat, including journalists, activists, and even politicians. These contracts were hidden deep within public records, buried under layers of bureaucracy, but Jacob found the courtroom was deadly still. No one dared interrupt, but murmurs of disbelief swept through the gallery. I knew my brother was in danger when he disappeared, Ethan said, his voice softer now, more personal. I started digging through his work, his research, and that's when I found something that shook me. The law firm representing the prosecution, the same one that's prosecuting me, was connected to one of the surveillance companies. They helped cover up Jacob's work, and then when Jacob started talking about what he'd found, he vanished. Ethan paused, his gaze turning cold as he addressed Ms. Grant directly for the first time. And that's when I realized I was the next target. They framed me for the hacking incident, to shut me up and make sure I couldn't follow my brother's trail, but I wasn't going to let that happen. Judge Halvorson sat back in his chair, his expression hardening as he processed the weight of Ethan's words. The courtroom was on edge, every eye locked on him, waiting for a reaction. I let them arrest me, Ethan said, his voice steady, but tinged with the resolve of someone who had made a difficult decision. It was the only way to get inside, to get close enough to expose the truth. A hushed silence settled over the courtroom. No one seemed to know how to respond. Grant stood there, visibly shaken, but trying to maintain her composure. You baited them, Judge Halvorson asked slowly, his eyes narrowing, searching Ethan's face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Ethan nodded. I had to. I couldn't have exposed this any other way. I knew they'd frame me, but I also knew they'd slip up, and they did. Judge Halvorson's gaze lingered on Ethan for a long moment, as if weighing the teenager's words against the weight of his actions. Finally, the judge spoke. "This is a lot to take in, Mr. Rivera." He looked down at the documents in his hand, his expression darkening. "But if what you say is true, this court has become part of a much larger, more dangerous game." Ethan didn't flinch. He knew this was only the beginning. The courtroom was silent, every person present grappling with the enormity of the revelations. The prosecution was visibly shaken, but Ethan didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on the judge, as if waiting for the next step in a process he had already anticipated. "You've thrown a lot of accusations at us, Mr. Rivera," Judge Halvorson said, his voice low. "But you've also opened a door that once opened, can never be closed again. This isn't just a trial anymore, it's a reckoning." Ethan gave a small knowing smile. "Exactly, Your Honor, and I'm ready for it." The courtroom remained silent, as the weight of the moment settled in, the beginning of an entirely new chapter in Ethan's fight for justice. The following morning, the atmosphere in courtroom 12B was electric with anticipation. No one had quite processed what had happened the day before, the revelations, the accusations, the stunning exposure of corruption. It was the kind of thing that would dominate headlines for weeks. But for Ethan Rivera, it was just another step in his plan. The final move was now in motion. FBI agents, clad in their dark suits and serious expressions, arrived early. They filed into the courtroom, their presence commanding immediate attention. Their eyes scanned the room, but they weren't here for just any case. They were here for Ethan. Without a word, Ethan walked to the center of the room, where he had already prepared what was perhaps the most crucial piece of evidence in his quest for justice, a small flash drive. He handed it to one of the lead agents, who took it with a nod of thanks. "Everything you need is right here," Ethan said, his voice cool, calm, and unwavering, as though the weight of the moment was nothing more than another logical step in his journey. The agent took the flash drive, his fingers briefly brushing against Ethan's. The significance of that moment didn't escape anyone in the room. This wasn't just an exoneration, it was the unraveling of an entire system. Within the encrypted files on that drive were the complete records of Jacob Rivera's research, the surveillance contracts, and evidence linking high-ranking government officials to the illegal activities. More importantly, it included the final proof that the law firm prosecuting Ethan had been directly involved in the cover-up. It was all there. By noon the courtroom was a different place. News spread quickly. Grant, once a towering figure in the district attorney's office, was escorted out in handcuffs, her face pale, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She had no fight left. The charges of corruption and misconduct were just the beginning of her fall from grace. Her involvement in the illegal surveillance and the manipulation of evidence had sealed her fate. Judge Halvorson watched the scene unfold from his seat at the bench. His eyes met Ethan's across the room. There was no longer any amusement in his gaze, just awe, a deep, almost reluctant respect. He had misjudged the teenager in front of him. It wasn't just that Ethan had outsmarted the prosecution, but that he had done so with a purpose much greater than his own defense. The judge cleared his throat, then addressed Ethan in a quiet, sincere tone. I misjudged you, Miss Rivera," Judge Halvorson said, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply gave a small, knowing smile, the same one he'd worn since the beginning of this ordeal. "It's okay, most people do." The judge sat back, clearly shaken by the realization. He had been quick to dismiss Ethan, just another rebellious teen trying to play the system. But Ethan had proven that justice was never about appearances or age. It was about the truth, and the courage to pursue it, no matter the cost. The courtroom proceedings moved quickly after the charges against Ethan were immediately dropped. There were no more legal battles to fight. He had won. But his victory wasn't just personal, it was monumental. The investigation into the illegal surveillance contracts had spread like wildfire, leading to the exposure of a nationwide scandal that would change the course of political and judicial oversight for years to come. Powerful figures were now being investigated, and their connections were being severed. The corruption had been exposed for all to see. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting for Ethan. Reporters surrounded him, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his face. The questions came fast and furious, each one more intrusive than the last. "Mr. Rivera, how does it feel to be cleared of the charges? Did you ever expect to bring down such a powerful network? What's next for you, now that you've changed the course of justice?" Ethan stood there, the chaos swirling around him, but his composure never wavered. He had faced everything that had been thrown at him with a quiet, unwavering resolve. Now, in this moment, He knew exactly what to say. He didn't need to explain himself any further. His actions had already spoken for him. Justice isn't about age, titles or appearance, he said, his voice steady and clear. It's about truth, and the courage to fight for it. With that, he turned and walked away from the media frenzy, his head held high. He had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth, taken down a corrupt system, and proven that the fight for justice didn't require a title, a suit, or even a law degree. Ethan Rivera had achieved what many thought impossible. He had changed the game, and this was only the beginning of his journey. Ethan Rivera's life had been completely transformed in a matter of weeks. What started as a simple court case, one that many had dismissed as the foolish stunt of an arrogant teenager, had evolved into something far greater, a turning point not just for him, but for the entire justice system. Ethan's courage, brilliance, and relentless pursuit of truth had made him a legend. The impact of his victory rippled out across the nation. His name became synonymous with justice, not just for his legal prowess, but for the way he had taken down a network of corruption that stretched to the highest levels of government. But for Ethan, the fame and recognition never changed who he was. While others saw a hero, he saw someone who had done what was right, regardless of the cost. It wasn't about fame, it was about exposing the truth. After the case was over, Ethan's life took a new turn. His actions had not gone unnoticed. Just a few weeks after the case concluded, he received an unexpected letter. It was from one of the top law schools in the country, an institution that had been following his case closely. They were offering him an honorary scholarship to law school, bypassing the usual admissions process. They saw in him, not just the brilliance of a student, but the passion of a future leader, who would undoubtedly make waves in the legal world. Ethan had never planned to attend law school so soon. He had been focused on his mission, on bringing the truth to light. But now, with this opportunity laid out before him, he realized that his fight for justice was far from over. This scholarship was more than just an academic offer. It was a sign that his fight had created a space for others to follow in his footsteps. But as incredible as the scholarship was, it wasn't the most emotional moment in Ethan's life during that period. The breakthrough in the case had also led to the unexpected return of his older brother Jacob. For months, Ethan had feared the worst. After Jacob went missing, the family had assumed that he'd been silenced, possibly even killed. The authorities had done little to help, assuming Jacob was just another casualty of the corruption he had uncovered. But with the FBI's investigation, and the newfound evidence that Ethan had uncovered, Jacob's whereabouts were eventually traced. To everyone's relief, Jacob was found alive, though in poor health and suffering from the trauma of his ordeal. He was placed under federal protection immediately, but the fact that he was alive was a miracle in itself. Ethan's first reunion with his brother was emotional and raw. There were no words that could fully capture the relief and joy they felt. Jacob had been through hell, but now, together, they could continue the work they had started. Only this time, they wouldn't be doing it alone. As Jacob slowly recovered and began to rebuild his life, Ethan's newfound fame began to take on a life of its own. Documentaries, interviews and news reports about Ethan's triumph flooded the media. Everyone wanted to know how a 17-year-old with no formal legal training had single-handedly dismantled one of the most powerful criminal networks in the country. His story inspired millions, not just young people who saw him as a beacon of hope, but even older, seasoned professionals who had witnessed firsthand the truth he had uncovered. Within months, Ethan's story had been compiled into a best-selling book, The Law of Truth, written by one of the country's top investigative journalists. The book detailed every aspect of Ethan's journey, from the moment he had decided to represent himself in court, to the way he had exposed the truth behind the government's illegal surveillance program. The book became a nationwide bestseller, with readers praising it not only for its gripping account of Ethan's battle against corruption, but also for the incredible resilience and determination he had displayed at such a young age. Despite all the media attention, the awards and the praise, Ethan remained humble. He never allowed the adoration of others to overshadow his sense of purpose. He knew that his journey was never about personal recognition, it was about justice. His fight was far from over, and now that he had the platform, he wanted to use it to continue making a difference. Determined to give back, Ethan founded a non-profit organization called Truth Rising. The goal of the organization was simple yet powerful: to help young people learn about the law, their rights, and how to use the justice system to fight for truth and equality. Truth Rising became an educational hub for teenagers and young adults, teaching them not only the fundamentals of law, but also how to navigate the complexities of the legal system in a way that empowered them to challenge corruption, injustice, and oppression. Ethan poured his heart into the project,
traveling across the country to speak at schools, community centers and youth programs. His message was clear: it doesn't matter where you come from or how old you are, you have the power to change the world, one truth at a time. The organization grew quickly, and its impact was undeniable. Teenagers who had never considered a career in law began enrolling in courses, getting involved in activism, and fighting for causes that mattered to them. Ethan's vision for truth rising was becoming a reality. The legacy of his work would continue for generations to come, shaping a future where justice was not just a concept for the privileged, but a right for all. Years later, Ethan would be remembered not just as the teenager who toppled a corrupt legal system, but as the man who used his newfound power to inspire others. He had risen above his circumstances, faced down impossible odds, and come out on top. But in the end, it wasn't about the fame, the accolades, or the recognition. It was about the truth, and the courage to fight for it. As Ethan looked back on everything he had accomplished, he couldn't help but think of one thing: this was just the beginning. He had always known that the system was broken, but now, with truth rising and his ever-growing influence, he had the tools to continue fixing it. The legend of Ethan Rivera had just begun. If that opening pulled you in, go ahead and smash that like button, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on what you would have done in Ethan's shoes. Would you have represented yourself, or played it safe and hired a lawyer? Let us know. Subscribe for more courtroom twists, both real and fictional, that will keep you on the edge of your seat and guessing until the last word. We've got plenty of jaw-dropping stories lined up.